Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro.
I'm Alicia Garcia.
I'm Mario Mariniello.
And today we are discussing about antitrust in China and its consequences for the rest of the world. This episode is part of Bruegel's focus on global China as seen from Europe, which includes as well our monthly newsletter, ZhōngHuá Mundus, to which we invite you to subscribe. The link is in the show notes. Little promotion aside, we are happy that Angela Huye Zhang, I hope that I'm pronouncing it in vaguely correct way, has joined us from Hong Kong to discuss today's topic. Angela is an expert on Chinese law and she has written extensively on Chinese antitrust enforcement. She is the author of Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism, How the Rise of China Challenges Global Regulation, published by Oxford University Press in March 2021. The book examines how Chinese exceptionalism, as manifested in the way China regulates and is regulated, is reshaping global antitrust regulation. Hi, Angela. How are you?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. And by the way, your pronunciation of my name is perfect.
Oh, thank you so much. You're so kind. So, back to the topic, China's rise as an economic superpower has caused growing anxieties in the West. Europe is now applying stricter scrutiny over takeovers by Chinese state-owned giants, while the United States is imposing aggressive sanctions on leading Chinese technology firms such as Huawei, TikTok, and WeChat. You have examined the most important and least understood tactic that China can deploy to counter Western sanctions, antitrust law. And one of the theses of your book is to explain how China has transformed antitrust law into a powerful economic weapon. Why is that the case and how?
Well, that's a very good question. And that is actually dealt with in the last chapter of my book, which is about regulatory interdependence, which means that how China applies its antitrust law depends very heavily on how other countries, particularly how the United States, will treat Chinese firms and its executives. And those of you in Europe are probably very well aware that the US executive branch has quite significant discretion in prosecuting foreign businesses and executives. And there have been several large cases involving European firms, right? Such as Alstom, such as BNP Paribas for violating US sanctions. And the United States have done the same on Chinese tech firms recently. And in 2018, the sanctions on Huawei, ZTE, and the rest of the Huawei CFO, Meng Wanzhou, these are really wake-up calls for the Chinese government, which suddenly realized that the US government has such strong extraterritorial sanctioning power, or we call the long-arm jurisdiction. So the Chinese government is seriously considering what it can do to counter such attack. And one of the tools they came up with is antitrust, precisely because antitrust allows the Chinese government to impose long-arm jurisdiction to exert extraterritorial control over foreign businesses. Now think about the merger between a large US company and a European firm that seemingly have little to do with China. But if these companies have sufficient sales to the Chinese market, then we need to obtain clearance from the Chinese antitrust authority. And then the Chinese government can strategically withhold its merger approval to gain bargaining leverage with the United States. One of the most prominent examples I gave in my book is Qualcomm's acquisition of NXP. And the deal obtained clearance from 8 jurisdictions, and China was the only one that held up this deal. And China didn't block the deal, but strategically held up this deal like a bargaining chip during negotiations with the United States.
Thank you, Angela. Alicia, what do you think about that?
Of course, a very good summary of where we stand. I think the key really for our listeners is how different is this from the rest of the world and what to expect next. And as a European, how much can all of this specific antitrust vision of the world, or I would say industrial policy even vision of the world, impact us, meaning Europe, meaning the world as a whole, after what I heard from you, Angela?
Well, that's an absolutely great question. And obviously, it seems like the tensions were between the United States and China, right? I mean, but it could have spillover effects on European companies, like the Qualcomm's proposed acquisition by NXP is an example, right? The target company is a European company. And similarly, recently, Cisco proposed to acquire Acacia, also a European company, and that deal was delayed for a really long time for similar reasons. And you can tell, this kind of strategic application of antitrust law could have spillover effects on European companies. And sometimes European companies are kind of caught in a hard on a rock place. There have been rumors that companies like HSBC will be put on reliable entity lists by the Chinese government because HSBC had cooperated with the US Department of Justice in submitting evidence that were unfavorable to Huawei and Meng Wanzhou's case. So I believe that Europe also have an interest in learning what's going on and behind those tensions between China and the US. But one thing I want to stress here is that it's not really in China's best interest to strategically use antitrust as a weapon, because this is also a self-destructive move for the Chinese government. Because in the best case scenario, China would not need to do that, because doing that would risk further decoupling from China, because more companies will be concerned about the investment in China and then they might leave China, right? So what China was doing now was trying to flex its muscle and demonstrate antitrust as a potential weapon to use. But it's more bark than bite. It's not until the very last resort China would use this weapon. And it's in the hope that having this weapon can deter the United States or can encourage US allies like those in Europe to try to persuade Washington to drop those sanctions against Chinese companies. That will be the best case scenario for the Chinese government.
Yeah, thank you very much, Angela. This is very, very interesting. I was wondering, because you refer to antitrust as a broad term to encompass everything that competition policy authorities in China are doing. But of course, you might want to differentiate between merger policy and antitrust. I wonder whether you see a similar pattern. Is it like merger policy that is used the most for pursuing strategic industrial policy objectives by the Chinese authorities? Or is it also antitrust, meaning more related to potential abuses of market dominance that is used as well for strategic purposes?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, obviously, what we have observed so far mostly occur in the realm of mergers, right? Those deals, those examples I gave just now all involve mergers. But there have been discussion and actually quite heated academic debates in China a few months ago, at the time when the United States threatened to cut off supplies to Huawei. There's a lot of discussion in China that, whether those boycotting of Huawei by the US companies could amount to a violation of the Chinese antitrust law. And obviously, these US companies were forced by the Chinese government to stop dealing with Huawei, and they can potentially defend themselves on the basis of foreign sovereign immunity. But the question of whether the Chinese government will recognize such defense will be another story. But at least on the face of it, the US company have, if they are able to successfully do the boycotting, and the Chinese firms have no alternative sources of supply, they could potentially run afoul of the Chinese antitrust law. And that will put US companies in a very difficult position. Obviously, we haven't really gotten to that point yet, but I did allude to this possibility. It's not like a very remote possibility, but this possibility remains that US companies could be found in violation of Chinese law for boycotting the supplies to Chinese firms.
Thanks, Angela, for that. I would like to go back to a different aspect of China's antitrust policy, which in a way goes beyond or actually is a different angle than the US-China strategic competition, but more of a domestic angle, although it may have consequences for the rest of the world. And this is really what we are seeing recently and increasingly so, which is really a quest for control of specific groups, whether it's fintech, whether it's unfinancial, whether it's e-commerce and beyond. And I'd like to understand how that antitrust policy is being used, whether the purpose that I just referred to, which is kind of what we generally hear in the news, is actually right, or you have a different view about this.
So compare with the US and the EU, Chinese antitrust is really a new kid on the block. That's what I said on page 1 of the paper. Because China really started to implement its anti-monopoly law in 2008, although it has very quickly become a major jurisdiction whose importance can rival the United States and EU. And this is mostly because China's vast consumer market, so very few multinational companies can succeed without, the Chinese market. Now, what I observe is that in the United States or in Europe, antitrust has a very specific goal of protecting consumers and restoring the competitive environment. But in China, law tends to be used as an instrument. It's not just unique to antitrust law. Law has generally been used as an instrument to advance various policies. And in China, antitrust is used as like a multi-purpose policy tool. And of course, antitrust is used to protect consumers in China, but agencies also apply it in a way to facilitate other goals. For instance, antitrust has been applied to achieve macroeconomic management objectives like stabilizing prices when there was inflation in China. And it has been used to advance trade and foreign policy goals, as we just talked about, right? During the Sino-US trade war. And more recently, as Alicia also mentioned, right? As a tool for industrial policy to try to nudge Chinese tech firms towards kind of like a different direction of investing more in foundational science and technology that can help China achieve self-sufficiency. So the Chinese antitrust policy is very flexible, very pragmatic, and very multi-purpose in that sense.
Thank you, Angela. If you forget for a second about this strategic consideration that you just mentioned, so obviously antitrust in China has probably a broader scope than the one that we at least I think we have here in Europe, where we try to stick to, let's say, consumer standard. I'm curious to know whether there is a discussion in China which could resemble a little bit the one that we are observing here in Europe, which is really about moving, particularly in the digital space, an ex post enforcement to an ex ante regulation to address many of the issues that we are experiencing in online markets. Clearly, also, online markets in China have issues with competition. For example, I saw this morning market shares of the online advertisement markets of Baidu, so the equivalent of Google, let's say, in China, and that I think amounts to around 32% for advertisement markets. So that looks also potentially problematic. So I guess, there must be concerns that are similar to the ones that we have in Europe, and I wonder whether in China they are considering similar approaches.
Right. China is obviously watching very closely what Europe is doing because Europe has always been deemed like a leading example in antitrust enforcement. And that's for sure. And policymaking is extremely fluid in China, so it's quite difficult to estimate one way or the other how China will move next. At least for now, I don't see China will immediately adopt an ex ante regulation like the Digital Service Act as happening in the EU. Now, I have to say the EU is the front runner in regulating big tech. They have been doing it for years or decades. And China literally just started enforcing its antitrust law against its own big tech a few months ago. We're talking about 6 months ago. So I think China will adopt kind of like a wait and see approach to see, whether its current enforcement will likely work. And if it gets to the point like Europe, that it seems like there's many areas of this type of ex post enforcement doesn't seem to work very well, maybe China will consider ex ante regulation. But I think that will take a few more years down the road, even for a country that tend to move very fast with policymaking. And another important point to bear in mind is that the institutional environment in China is drastically different from that in Europe. In Europe, when you see the big tech companies are challenged by the commissions, they are fighting tooth and nail with the commission, right? I mean, they will go to court, they will defend their case. But in China, the Chinese big tech just raise their hands and vow to comply with the government's policy. There's no challenge in court, right? I mean, the Chinese companies are much more obedient and they quickly bow to the government's demands. So you have very different institutional dynamics in China. And that also have implication as to the type of policy tools that the Chinese government would use.
There is a very important issue related to the size of these companies that I guess is prompting the antitrust push in China, although I have to say it's slightly biased towards private companies, but that's a different topic. But because of this humongous size, which by the way now explains that China has more Fortune 500 than the US, let alone Europe, the topic is not only China, but really, how the rest of the world copes with it, and how we rely on China's antitrust policy. I'm not even talking about how China uses the policy for US-China strategic competition, but actually how China uses it to promote competition in China, and that's global competition. So what are your prospects for this? Should we have high hopes that global competition will be enhanced, or do you think that China is pushing for huge global champions, which would reduce global competition? And this is important for us Europeans because, we've been working, not us, but the European Commission, on a proposal to control foreign subsidies, the distortion of the single market through foreign subsidies. So as these companies become bigger and bigger, the way to hope that this won't happen is to expect that China's market will be competitive, you see what I mean? And thus, basically, naturally, we won't need to rely on such measures. So what's your take on this?
Right, that's an excellent question, right? I mean, one thing I want to emphasize at the beginning is our Chinese tech giants, with the exception of Huawei, which was not targeted in this round of the crackdown, and I would estimate Huawei would be highly unlikely to be targeted ever. We're talking about companies like Alibaba and Tencent, which have a very tiny foothold outside of China. I was looking at Alibaba's annual report the other day because I'm trying to assess the amount of fine it was subject to penalty. And then you'll see, Alibaba has less than 10%, maybe only 7% on top of my head. Only 7% of its revenue actually came from outside of China, and the vast majority of its revenue are in Southeast Asia. It has a very small presence overseas. So if you look around the Chinese tech giants, with the exception of ByteDance, which produce TikTok, okay, and with the exception of Huawei, right, which produce telecom equipment, Chinese internet giants, even including Alibaba and Tencent, have a very small footprint overseas. So to the extent that the Chinese government can bring these companies, discipline them with antitrust law to try to make the domestic market more competitive, it actually have a very negligible impact on the competition in the rest of the world. And for these Chinese companies to succeed overseas, they are met with tremendous resistance from foreign governments. And one of the biggest obstacles that they have, as I wrote in the book, is actually their Chinese identity, because there's so much suspicion about Chinese companies acting as Trojan horse in foreign companies. They're worried about the data protection issues. And that's the reason why the Trump administration blocked, TikTok, blocked WeChat recently, right? I mean, so the domestic crackdown doesn't really change the competition dynamics in Europe, right? Simply because these are small players. But on the other hand, the domestic crackdown, what I see it, might possibly facilitate China's goal to achieve technological self-sufficiency. Because the Chinese tech giants like Alibaba and Tencent, they are really good with consumer internet businesses, right? I mean, China have led in mobile payments, fintech, and e-commerce. But China, is still very weak in terms of those foundational science and technology, and that was clearly exposed during the Sino-US trade war. So I believe that the Chinese government is trying to gain more leverage through this antitrust crackdown to nudge these Chinese tech giants like Alibaba and Tencent towards kind of like a different direction, right? I mean, you need to invest more in those key sectors that can help China close the gap in its tech rivalry with the United States. And that's my guess.
So, Angela, if I understand correctly, you're saying that the crackdown is used unevenly within the landscape. There is still somehow a geopolitical or a political economic purpose in the way this is being used.
Oh, that's a very good point, right? I mean, so I think the Chinese actions are actually long overdue. I mean, they should have done this much earlier rather than waiting until now. Right? I mean, so there's a clear antitrust issue behind it. But what I'm suggesting here is that this crackdown, because it does give the government a lot of leverage going after these companies because they're so successful, they are very dominant in the Chinese market. And so the biggest vulnerability is antitrust regulation, right? I mean, so the government have gained the leverage to go after these companies, and that will facilitate the cooperation with the government. Right? If you align yourself with the government's line, align yourself with the government's goal, then it's a form of self-protection. It's less likely the government will go after you, right? I mean, you don't see the Chinese government go after Huawei for abusing dominance in the Chinese market, right? I mean, so alignment of the Chinese Communist Party's interests is a way of self-protection for these companies in the current, regulatory environment in China.
May I ask a quick question to Andrew, because I'm very interested.
Yeah, sure.
So my question is more like, again, I would like to go back to more the internal perspective, from the Chinese consumer's perspective, really, what it means, more than a global strategic perspective. If you make a parallel with what is happening here in Europe, there was a recognition by the European Commission that the digital space and the antitrust space very much overlap, right? And this, the most blunt example of that is that you have Vice President Vestager, who has the portfolio for antitrust enforcement and also for the broad digital agenda. Now, Vice President Vestager has recently presented a proposal for regulating artificial intelligence, where you have the distinction between high-risk and low-risk applications. So applications that potentially are very harmful for individual citizens in Europe. Now, I wonder, what is the interplay from the perspective of the individual in China? What is the interplay between antitrust in China and the broad digital agenda that China has, for example, on artificial intelligence? We talk a lot about the social credit system, for example, in China. Does the antitrust have a role, in your view, there too, in order to establish some kind of boundaries where you can see some harm that can come to the Chinese society as well? Or this is completely out of the picture? I'm really curious.
Well, we were watching closely what Europe is going to do to regulate AI, because China is a forerunner in AI right now. It's a global leader in AI development. So Chinese tech firms and Chinese regulators are watching closely what Europe will do next, because it might have a very strong impact in the Chinese technology export. At the moment in China, there is very little discussion about the policy debates. I mean, there still remain very nascent discussion about how to regulate AI. I mean, mostly because this is such a new project, right? I mean, such a new product, and there is a natural long lag in regulating innovations in China. It has taken China almost a decade to wake up and realize we need to regulate big tech. Although I have to say, it's a little bit too late because, once the monopolies form, as the Europeans have found out, it's very difficult to reverse it, right? I mean, now that's precisely why you had the DMA, right? But now we have a very concentrated digital economy. We have a few very strong top players, and these players know how to deal with the Chinese bureaucracy very well. They know how to see regulatory arbitrage. They know how to take advantage of the geopolitical tensions with other countries to try to work it towards their advantage, right? I mean, if you think about techno-nationalism. So I really don't know how the next episode of the Chinese regulation of big tech will play out in the next few years, right? I mean, this dynamic is extremely fluid. It's not just, the consideration for the Chinese antitrust regulator or even the bigger Chinese government. It's really broad. It's not just protecting consumers. You also need to consider industrial policy, consider foreign policy. That's why I think it's very important to understand Chinese economic policy through the lens of the broader political economy, and not just within China, but also outside of China, which have a clear influence on how China shapes its domestic regulation these days.
Going back to what it means for Europe, Angela, hearing you, the positive is that antitrust is here to stay in China, and if we look at the lessons from Europe, this is good news. The negative, though, is that it is a very particular type of antitrust. One is confronting the US, or kind of retaliating, if I may use that word, although you didn't, in the same way as the US did. So putting back the pressure into the US, trying to find the same tools, extraterritoriality and the like. But that's the US. But for us Europeans, I think what it really means is that the united front, if I may call it that way, in terms of powerful, if not state-owned, but close to the state-type companies, are here to stay. And the alliance will be even bigger. So that in a way responds to the question I asked in the middle of the conversation. And it is really that I don't think we're going to see more kind of independent, if I may say, big companies from China competing in the world. So this is something for Europeans to take note.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Angela, for joining us from Hong Kong for this episode, and Mario. And I would like to thank all the listeners for having joined for this episode of The Sound of Economics. And I would like to remind you once again that this is part of Bruegel's focus on global China, as seen from Europe, which includes as well a monthly newsletter, ZhōngHuá Mundus, to which we invite you to subscribe. The link is in the show notes. And as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Thanks a lot for joining The Sound of Economics. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.